Hey everyone, welcome back to the Casual Watch Review channel. Today we're looking at a watch that I personally backed on Kickstarter well over 9 months ago now, and it arrived this week. I think this watch has one of the most interesting histories of any watch that I've reviewed recently, and I'm really excited to show you what an excellent job they have done of the design. However, unfortunately for me, there is one big letdown. The watch is the Wolbrook Skindiver. The watch is new on Kickstarter, but the brand is not new. One of the original watches, like the one I have here, had one very famous owner that spurred on the revival of this once famous brand by its new French owners. So in 1949, Wolbrook and its sister brand Douglas were born. Their most distinguished timepiece was a special tool watch from the 1960s, which has been nicknamed the Skindiver World Timer by collectors. These watches became renowned for their water resistance, and they were that famous for their water resistance they were sold in water-filled containers. These watches functionally have not aged well. The case size by modern standards is small at 35mm, and they featured a plastic bezel that we can see is totally missing on this vintage version. Not to mention the base metal used for the cases that has clearly seen better days on my version here. As such, the brand is not one of the most iconic watches of yesteryear that is sought after by collectors. In fact, I picked this one up on eBay for only $15. If it was not for that very famous owner, I suspect this brand would have been lost forever. So who is that owner, and why have you not heard of this brand based on how famous that owner was? Well, the owner was Neil Armstrong, and I'm guessing if you're new to watch collecting, you may be wondering why he would wear this watch when he is so famously associated with Omega. Well, that is an interesting story in itself, and it would take me a lot longer on here to tell it, but suffice to say, Neil Armstrong's Omega actually failed on that moon landing. But even if he had worn it on the moon, none of the crew, including Buzz, who was the actual first person to wear an Omega on the moon, got to keep their iconic watches. All of their equipment on that space flight did belong to the US government, including their watches. In fact, unfortunately, when on Buzz's return, he posted his Speedmaster back to the US government and it went missing. So far, it's never been found. Now, if you think 17 million for Paul Newman's Rolex Daytona was a record breaker, imagine if someone had Buzz Aldrin's Omega hiding in their attic, maybe from a light-fingered uncle who worked at the Postal Service. I think if that ever sees the light of day, all bets would be off for the millions that might go for. So the famous owner of the Douglas, again the sister brand of Wolbrook, was in fact Neil Armstrong. So how do we know this? Well, his actual version came up for sale on auction not too long ago by his brother Dean. Neil Armstrong was a test pilot, so there's a romantic idea that he wore this Skindiver on some pretty daring test flights. Honestly, nobody knows for sure, as no photos exist as far as I can tell of him wearing the watch. But it does add to the romance of the brand and is as good a reason as any to take a second go at this watch and bring it up to modern standards. And that's what Wolbrook have done here with this version, which is their World Timer Professional. The watch itself is very well executed, with the exception on mine that the Cyclops is slightly wonky. To be honest, I expected more quirks with it being a Kickstarter watch. With the two watches side by side, it's clear the new version is a recreation of the old one, not an inspired by or homage to the original. They have taken everything great about the legacy watch and made it better, with the exception of one thing that I'll touch on later. The World Time bezel is a fun addition and has a nice action to it. If you're not familiar with World Time bezels, they are cool but nowhere near as functional as a GMT watch that has a separate hand for another time zone, or arguably even a 12-hour bezel that allows you to offset a period of time, like 3 hours ahead for example. The World Time bezel basically lets you set your home city based on the position of the hour hand currently. So you would technically have to move it every hour if you wanted to consistently see a second time zone. Let's have a look at it here. My home city is LA, so you can quickly see the time in the UK from here. One thing that did confuse me was why the bezel was unidirectional. It would have been a lot more functional as an omnidirectional, which means it moves both ways. I asked this in the comments section of the Kickstarter, and the designers said it's also a countdown bezel. Now, I totally missed this, but it does have some tiny numbers underneath the cities as well. Still, I'm sure the original one moved in both directions. In fact, I'm pretty sure it did. The case really looks the business. It's solid feeling with drilled lugs. The case back has the Apollo lander as a nod to Neil Armstrong. The engraving is just gorgeous. The crown is nicely proportioned, but it's not screw down. The watch still purports to have 100-meter water resistance, however. I have mine here on a Tropic, but it did come with a very nice leather NATO and a nice carry case. 10 out of 10 for the box. Not only is it a simple cardboard box, but it looks like it's been military issued with its various stamps and stickers on there. The dial and hands are exact replicas of the original, even going so far as to say shock resistant on the dial. You never see this on watches anymore because Inca block and other technologies are ubiquitous across most mechanical movements. The hands, again, are straight from the original. Maybe this is something I'd enhance for future versions, as they do look very flat, especially behind that great sapphire crystal. The original had plexi, and there is a version that also has this. I opted for the much more usable sapphire. I like everything about the dial. Even the second hand is a loving recreation of the original. The loom is okay, but it's not as good as Seiko loom. But it isn't bad, especially for a quick Kickstarter watch. I know the loom for most brands is a trial and error process as the brand evolves, and I'm going to be a close follower to see what they come with next. Also, I hope I'm not the only Kickstarter backer that thought the hands might be white. I think that was just because of the photograph. Clearly by now, you can see that I can't say enough positive things about the case, the dial, and the bezel of the watch. One of the few vintage reissues that is honestly an improvement in nearly every way over the original, as the original has just been made with modern parts. It's less vintage inspired than the same watch but perfectly executed with modern parts and sizing. They have done an excellent job here. So why did I mention at the start that there's one thing that I feel lets down this watch? Because honestly, that's how I feel about the movement they have used. For such an incredible watch design, I feel like the movement, for me, lets it down. Now, before I start on the movement, let me tell you why I feel so passionately about this. For a start, I wanted the quartz, and I backed that first. But I love a watch with the date. As the original had the date, it totally completed the look. As the quartz had no date, during the campaign, I decided to pay the extra for the mechanical version. Surprisingly, for a watch reviewer like myself, I have very little experience with Miyota movements. It seems that the standard for most watches these days is Seiko's TMI NH35A or the 36. I know Miyota have a higher end 9000 series, but anything for the 8000 series was a mystery to me, and I honestly should have researched them more. I have a bias towards Citizen. I think they make some of the best watches going, so I assume the movement would be more than adequate for this watch. What I didn't expect is by far the most noisiest rotor on a watch I have ever heard. And it's so poorly featured, it doesn't even have a hacking second hand. Just because Seiko got away with selling the 7S26 movement for more years than was gentlemanly, doesn't mean it's acceptable to have this lack of hacking feature in any modern dive watch, in my opinion. My opinion for what it's worth. One thing I learned, this Miyota movement only winds clockwise, so it free spins in the other direction. Not uncommon, as the 7750 does this also. It has no resistance in the opposite direction. The result is a rotor that is so noisy You feel like a clown on roller skates is advancing behind you, ready to make you its next victim. This noise, unfortunately, is enhanced by the excellent job that Wolbrook did of making the thin case. One of the few things the Miyota has going for it is its thinness. The Miyota movements are thinner in general over Seiko ones. The argument has been made, it brought the cost of the watch down, but the cost was not the reason I backed the watch, it was the story and the design. I would have paid more for this watch with an ETA movement, or for the same watch with a Seiko NH35A in it, a movement that parts-wise is cheaper than this Miyota. Despite my reservations about the movement and the wonky Cyclops, I do really like this watch. In a follow-up video, Chris and I, who I run the podcast with, check out Casual Watch Talk on iTunes, will strip this watch down, take the movement out and try and upgrade it with a better movement. That's if we don't destroy the very delicate hands in the process. Let me know what you guys think in the comments section. As always, I really appreciate your comments, and I'll see you next time on the Casual Watch Review channel. Thanks guys, bye.